Richard, the paper you chose is by Brad East. So could you introduce this author to us, please?
Sure, yes, the paper is by Brad East, but actually there's not a lot of Brad East in it. He introduces another theologian, but just to say that Brad East is the Assistant Professor of Theology at Abilene Christian University in Texas in the States. I hadn't come across him before, but I came across this article. It looked interesting, and then I found what I could about the author, Brad East.
Brad East. And why did you choose this paper for discussion? It's titled Public Theology in Retreat.
I was looking at the website Arts and Letters Daily, which occasionally has a theological article, and when it does, I'm interested, because I'm interested in any article that they think is worthy to be on their page from theology. And I thought the title Public Theology in Retreat was intriguing, interesting.
And what would you say are the main points in the paper?
Well, he starts off with this question: where is the Reinhold Niebuhr for today? So he's referring there to Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a great ethicist and Reformed theologian in the United States. He was 1892 to 1971. So I'm not sure how many people today would recognise the name Reinhold Niebuhr. Certainly a well-known name in Christian circles in a previous generation, and I presume in the States still a well-known name to those in the theological world. I remember when I was at Union Theological College in Richmond, Virginia in 1980, they often referred to Reinhold Niebuhr. He was, and I used to have a book of his, and I've lost it, and I want to get it again. Leaves from the Notebook of a Tame Cynic, written in 1930. He was he was a minister and a theologian. He was a minister in Detroit, and he was very brave in his speaking against the Ku Klux Klan in the 1930s and then later in the 40s. So certainly a major figure in theology in the States. Sometimes accused wrongly of being a communist, but I noticed that I've read that Martin Luther King acknowledged a debt to Reinhold Niebuhr, but I haven't found out exactly what that debt was or how he expressed it. And also former President Obama said that Niebuhr was his favourite theologian. So it had a huge influence on the theological world of the time, at a time when I suppose in the United States theologians were listened to by public figures and by the public in general much more than is the case today. So Brad East starts his article by saying, where is the Reinhold Niebuhr for today? And talks about the situation in the United States and pretty much all the Christian world today, where it seems that theology has had to retreat from the public realm. Its voice is not heard, or if it is heard, it's not often, and it's fleetingly, where some brave person manages to speak up and the media takes notice of what they're saying. But I think that's the case in New Zealand too. When I think back to the 1950s and 60s, I think it was quite common for people like Jack Somerville to chat to politicians, and so their views at that time were taken quite seriously. That was certainly the case in the States with Reinhold Niebuhr. He was listened to even if people didn't agree with him. But Brad East talks about something, and this drew me to this article. He talked about code switching, which is a term from linguistics. So when I went back to university later in life and studied linguistics, we became quite familiar with the idea of code switching, and that is changing from one language to another. So people who can speak two languages or more. And Brad East says that Christians today are in the situation of having to code switch. So they might talk Christian on a Sunday, and the rest of the week they're talking in a secular way. And that's the case for theologians as well. And bridging that gap between the world of Christian tradition and Christian history and Christian voice today and the secular world is a major challenge. And so his answer, am I still answering the question?
You are still answering the question. Some of the main points on the paper. You're doing brilliantly.
Just by the way, with Reinhold Niebuhr, if you remember the Reverend Peter Marshall in New Zealand, he was the former master of Knox College, and he was the minister when I was at St Ninian's in Christchurch. He was very much influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr, Peter Marshall, and you can imagine too that he had a strong foundation in the Bible, but his attitudes were fairly liberal, and he was very strong on ethics. He explored things ethically very well, Peter Marshall. That I put down to a kind of Niebuhr influence as one of the influences. But Brad East, in attempting to answer the question, where is the Reinhold Niebuhr for today, introduces us to David Bentley Hart, a name I hadn't been familiar. I think I'd heard of him. And David Bentley Hart, he was born in 1965. He was an Anglican, has belongs now to the Eastern Orthodox tradition. He's a prolific writer and theologian, and really people have taken notice of him, and different newspapers have taken notice of him, and he's published books, not that I've seen them, but there's one called The Experience of God, published in 2013, that I thought I'd like to chase up. He's got a strong aesthetic sense of God as beautiful as well as eternal, and God is the source of all that is rich and beautiful. He's quite feisty, David Bentley Hart, so he's got no time for the Richard Dawkins of this world. He accuses them and our whole society of being enthralled to scientism and technocracy. And in his view, scientism, and that is the view that science can provide for the answers to the questions that really matter. And if they can't be answered scientifically, they're not real questions, or they belong to the world of poetry or imagination or another part of society. Well, he calls that a barbarous fundamentalism, according to David Bentley Hart, and he's restating Orthodox Christianity in a very succinct but also prolific way. I'm not sure whether you'd call him neo-Orthodox theologically, but because he comes out of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, but he appears to be restating what I would think was fairly mainstream Christianity with a kind of aesthetic, mystical dimension as well. And it's because he does it so well that I think he's being talked about in this article. And so he's a voice to be reckoned with in the United States today, perhaps even in the world of theology, just through the sheer force of his scholarship and his voice. You can hear him and see him on YouTube, and you can see that he's a great apologist for the Christian faith today in today's secular world. He's prolifically read, so he understands the philosophers, Nietzsche and the other great philosophers of the Western canon, and is attempting to speak to today's world. So the force of the article really from Brad East is that it introduces me to, and anybody else who reads it, to David Bentley Hart, someone I'd like to see more of his works.
Well, I was going to ask that, is it an article that's left you wanting to know more?
Yes.
David Bentley Hart.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it doesn't send me back to Brad East, but it sends me to David Bentley Hart. So that's a way that's something for me in the future to look at. I'm quite drawn to the Eastern Orthodox tradition myself. I'll never become an Eastern Orthodox person, but I'm quite aware of the aesthetic dimension.
Yeah.
But I'm not at all drawn to some of their other views on them. However, and I think in the end Brad East, in answer to the question, where is the Reinhold Niebuhr for today, I think he doesn't think that David Bentley Hart is a new Reinhold Niebuhr, but he's perhaps the most prominent voice to be heard from the Christian world to today's world in Brad East's view. in the United States at least.
Right. Yeah.
So perhaps that sends us in Aotearoa New Zealand to thinking who are the voices for us. And
do you have any thoughts about that?
look, can I come back to you on that?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. I'm just aware that we're going back to the United States, and that I don't know why that is. Perhaps their voices are so strong and well articulated, and the scholarship is so good. But I'm sure my next move might be to identify the voices in New Zealand that are really prophetic and able to speak in a secular society.
Do you want me to ask these other questions?
Yes.
Have you found the ideas in the paper useful in either your daily life and or your work?
I think David Bentley Hart's emphasis on the aesthetic and on the beautiful has just tweaked my imagination to a certain extent. And now I'm looking, I hope, with more perception at the trees we can see out the window at the moment, and the leaves turning to red and orange, and apprehending something of God's goodness and creativity in beauty. I'm not sure that's useful, but it's certainly spoken to me.
Yeah. Something you're grateful
indirectly, because it doesn't come from his work. It's only as I've read about him through Brad East.
Would you recommend the paper? And who would you recommend it to?
Yes, I would recommend the paper. It's 9 pages. It was originally published in the Los Angeles Review of Books. I'd recommend it to anyone who wanted to ask the question, who is David Bentley Hart, as an introduction to his work, but then I would go straight to his work. So.